Well, thanks, Don. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's always fun for Gerald and I to talk at meetings like this, particularly STMA. I remember being here as a grad student, and it's cool to still be involved now as a professor. Today's session is going to be very different. You have sat in a lot of rooms and listened to people like Gerald and myself flip through slides and waited until it was over, got your CEUs, and went on to the next thing. That is not what we're going to do today. This is going to be very interactive. Our hope is it's interactive enough that we fill 90 minutes, and if it's not, we're going to be out of here in 15 to 20. But we're going to try. The idea for this talk, when we were thinking about, well, what could we present at STMA that would be relevant on the subject of weed control, we thought to ourselves, well, you know, we sit down, whether it's at a hotel bar or at a field day with ourselves or other colleagues or sports field managers, and we just kind of talk about turf and talk about turf weed control and, hey, what did you do on this field this year and how'd you keep it weed free? And we have these conversations about kind of the way to go about thinking about building a program to control weeds and turf, and we felt that'd be kind of a cool talk if we could pull it off. We've never done this before, so when Don says, please, we need your feedback and evaluations, we can take it. If this is terrible, please let us know that it's terrible, and we will shelf it and not do it again. Or if you have ideas for ways to make it better, we would love to hear those ideas, because this is a maiden voyage for us. Is there anything you'd like to add, Dr. Henry?
I think you did a great job.
All right, we're going to move on. So
you can crush him on the reviews, just be gentle for me. I'm more sensitive.
So we put this in here kind of as a filter to understand the age breakdown of the audience.
Again,
so
he put this in here.
If you remember this movie, you're of a certain age demo, and if you're not and you're really confused, well, that's fine. But in all seriousness, though, you know, planning is something when we talk about weed control that it's really essential. There's a lot of great planning quotes that are out there. This is one from Winston Churchill. He who fails to plan is planning to fail. And I think that this is really relevant in the modern era of trying to control some of our most problematic weeds and turf. You know, my program at Tennessee, we do tons of work on annual bluegrass control, both in warm and cool season turf. We have all of these resistance issues now with annual bluegrass evolving resistance to all different herbicides, and that could be a whole seminar and breakdown into and of itself. We have goosegrass issues in turf that seem to be worsening. How many people in here think it's harder to control goosegrass right now than it was 5 years ago? Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. And I don't know why that is. I have some ideas. We'll talk about that maybe in a little bit more detail when we get into building some programs later. And then sedge and Kalinga issues. Who fights sedge and Kalinga? Who's north of Virginia and fights sedge and Kalinga? Yeah, pretty scary. I mean, I know Matt Elmore at Rutgers. You know, he's working on sedge and Kalinga in New Jersey. It's in Connecticut, Massachusetts. Some of our more southern weeds migrating to the north. And, you know, here's another good quote. So a goal without a plan is just a wish. You know, meeting with plenty of sports field managers. I hear lots of people talk about they want to have weed-free turf, but they have no plan on how they're going to do it, right? And that's an issue when we think about weeds that are hard to control, whether they have resistance issues. Maybe we have a lack of herbicides available or a lack of weed control tactics because we don't have herbicides available at all based on the legislative makeup of the area in which we live. This can lead to some bad things, right? So if we don't have a plan, we reactively spray. We see a weed and we try to kill it. We don't put a much more thought into it than that.
Did you take that picture on your flip phone, or is it just that bad?
I can neither confirm nor deny where I took that photo.
Is that from Tom Sample's collection?
I can neither confirm nor deny. This is being recorded. But this is a problem in all seriousness, that we have this mindset, and it's kind of amazing working in weed control that this is a thing when we contrast this with what we do with managing diseases in turf. You know, we think about how diseases are managed. People sit down and say, okay, I'm going to have a program. I know the diseases that can come into my turfgrass situation. Here's the tools I have available to manage those diseases. And here's how I'm going to use them over the course of the year to try to keep my turf as disease-free as possible. Why we don't put that level of forethought into our weed control decisions, I don't really know, right? We've moved now, if you come to Tennessee's field day, rather than seeing here's all the crabgrass herbicides and here's all the sedge herbicides and here's all the broadleaf weed control herbicides, we've kind of restructured things to say, all right, here's a block of Bermuda grass. I want to keep this Bermuda grass as weed-free as I can keep it. How would I do that? How would I go from January to January as weed-free as possible in a way that's diversified and sustainable? So before we delve into the audience interaction, to get some terms out there, what is a program? A program is a holistic approach to season-long weed control. And there's a chemical piece to this, and there's an environmental piece. And it can't be a program if you don't have both, right? Because if you just rely on the chemicals, that's not a program, right? So when we think about the chemical side, what do we have to do to use those tools as effectively as possible? Well, we got to know what weed we're trying to control, right? That's that can't be assumed that the weed ID is correct. Once we get that weed identified correctly, what's the right product? There's a lot of products out there, especially as things have gone off patent. Now we have multiple trade names for the same active ingredient. This can be confusing. What's my rate? What's my timing? Right? What's the best time of year to make this application? What's the optimal rate to use when using that product? And then the last piece of this is mode of action rotation. And again, that's really going to become relevant in the discussion about resistance management. Gerald, you want to speak about the environmental side of this coin?
I think what Jim was trying to talk about earlier when he was making reference to diseases is that I'm sure anyone that's taken a turfgrass course, you've seen that disease triangle. So you have, the host, you have the pathogen, and you have the environment. And we never seem to look at the environment enough when it comes to controlling weeds. Like Jim referenced before, and I'm sure not everyone here, does this, but a lot of us, the first thing we do when we see an infestation is, okay, what chemical am I going to utilize, and not really sort of dig deep and understand that if you have certain weeds that pop up and they are the prevalent species, they're indicating something, that there's something going wrong in your environment. And some of the changes to the environment that you can make, changes to your cultural practices, whether they're fertilizer, whether it's something environmental like shade, whether it's mowing heights or things like that, they can actually help decrease the populations to a point where you have a better chance of controlling things. If you're sitting with 90% cover of Kalinga, and then making the assumption that your irrigation system's working correctly, that's probably a bad assumption. If you can make some adjustments culturally, get those populations down to 20, 30%, then when you make an application, you have a better chance of actually getting control than just, again, relying on that chemical.
I agree. You think about that environmental side, decisions about how to maximize the effectiveness of the chemical side. Well, there's cultivar differences, right, amongst our grasses. One of the things our lab worked on this year was as these new Bermuda grasses hit the market for sports field use, whether it's Latitude or Tahoma or Tiftuff, we kind of assume, well, it's hybrid Bermuda grass, so its tolerance profile is going to be what 419 is, right, because, well, it's hybrid Bermuda grass. And that's not really true. We're seeing some of these new Bermuda grasses have some unique kind of idiosyncrasies, if you will, about what they're tolerant to and what they're not tolerant to. Gerald spoke to the fertilizer side, the shade side, and then in sports turf in particular, there's the traffic component that's a layer in all this, right? Because if we have weeds that like compacted soils and trafficked environments, that has to be managed for a program to be as effective as possible. So, using management as a segue, I think it's important to talk about some expectations today. You're not going to leave here with a cookbook. We don't want you to expect that you're going to leave here with, well, here's what I'm going to spray this year, or here's what I'm going to do this year, right? We want this to kind of be a dialogue really about how to think programmatically. Our hope is that you'll leave here and maybe be inspired, moved to think, well, okay, it's January, maybe my season hasn't fully started. How could I try this at my facility on one of my fields to think programmatically in the 2020 season? We're not going to leave with all the answers. And again, the cookbook side of this is not something we want you to be expecting. And really, I have on here your QB1 on your own agronomic choices. And I think that's an important message. Far too often, we visit with sports field managers and golf course superintendents and turf managers in general that are using early order programs to decide what their program is going to be for the year, right? Putting together, well, this is how I'm going to manage my field because this is the best deal I can get on a suite of products. And that is misguided, in my opinion. I think that these are wonderful ways for you to maximize the effectiveness of your budget to get products that make sense for you and are put together in a way that you can get every bit of value out of your budget that you can, but they shouldn't decide what goes on your field. You should make that call. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about how to build a program. And this is where we enter the audience interaction portion. Because Georgia won more games than Tennessee this year, Gerald.
Are you talking about this century? Or?
Gerald will be the one that is going to recruit information, and I've been demoted to scribe. So Gerald's going to ask some questions to somebody in the audience. We will need a volunteer. We can play chicken until we get one. Have at it, buddy.
Oh, joy. All right, so like Jim said, I need a volunteer. So we need someone that manages a facility. It can be one field. It can be 100 fields. I don't really care about the sport. But we need someone who manages a facility in a warm season climate.
And we're going to do a cool season.
Yes, we will get to the other part
as well.
And does anyone want to volunteer?
We got a volunteer. Take it.
All right, we'll go.
We got two. Maybe if we have time, Phil, we can do two.
All right, so I have to read off your sheet here. So where are you located within?
Modesto, California.
Okay. And I cannot stand in front of that. I'm going to lose my left ear.
I have never had to type in front of an audience before.
There's always the first.
I'm learning. All right.
Technically, he's typing because I can't spell worth anything. So, do you know what your soil type is roughly? I mean, you don't have to give me classification.
Sandy loam.
Okay.
Okay.
On the edge of our seats here. Turfgrass species, do you have?
Bermuda, don't know what kind.
Do you know if it's a hybrid or a common?
It's been there since 1976. Whatever blows in on the wind.
All right.
With parental rye.
So you overseed?
Yes.
Okay.
I really hope the video gets my misspellings. All right. And then anything we should know about the facility, miscellaneous, just.
It's 4 fields. There's like this hard pan that's between some places 8 inches down to 3 feet down that I can't get through with an excavator. It's weird.
What do you have for sports that are played on? Okay.
Pony League baseball. Irrigation, yes. Well water.
You know, roughly games played?
We start in March and we end in July.
Would you consider it heavy traffic or just moderate?
Heavy traffic.
Okay.
2 games per night on each field.
Just going to point out irrigation spelled wrong. I just want to make sure that you see
Thank
that.
you.
Okay.
And the irrigation, again, it's a pony league. It's like Little League. It's got a lot of volunteers in the past. So, it's a hot flash of irrigation that I'm trying to remedy. So there's hit and misses. Some places get, we got 3 heads in an area and then no heads in another area. It's like, okay, somebody, water's kind of.
I'm just going to say I've never seen that before, but, I'm just kidding. All right, moving into weeds, and this is, you may not touch on all these, but so do you have issues with crabgrass?
Yes.
How bad? So if it's 100% crabgrass sod, that's a 9, and if it's perfect Bermuda grass, that's a 1.
At about a 3.
Okay.
It's
Have you?
Okay. POA?
yes.
Same scale, 1 to 9.
About a 6 now.
Okay.
Sedge about a 3.
Dallas
Dallas
grass.
Dallas, I'd say about a 3 on that right now.
Okay.
Signal, don't know. BLW, I don't know.
Broadleaf weeds.
Broadleaf weeds.
Just in general.
Oh, right. Probably a 4.
Okay.
Anything else as weeds that are issues or encroachment of some other grasses?
And the clover.
So clover's just something to note here. Okay.
And yeah, I did some Q4D last year, and it seems to be taking care of some of the stuff, so it's not as bad as it used to be.
Okay.
So the things that you've noted here, are you seeing any issues where you've had control previously and maybe that control has sort of tapered off? Anything odd with just plants surviving?
No, just I came in 3 seasons ago, it's my 4th season, and it was a mess, and I'm working to get it to not be a mess.
Okay.
It hasn't gotten worse.
Good. That's what we like to hear. So what's your nitrogen program?
First year in, we don't have a program.
Okay.
Just put it that way.
Do you know roughly how much you may
I did
apply
one
in
shot,
pounds?
Last year. Again, it's a nonprofit. We don't have a lot of money.
I got you.
And I actually had a guy come out and do samples. He gave me recommendations. I presented to the board. Well, we don't have money for that. I said, okay, I'll just keep watering him.
So would you say you feel like you need more nitrogen than what you're putting on? Okay.
Okay. All right. And you said somebody came in and did soil samples, so I assume they tested for phosphorus and potassium? Okay. Do you know what the results were? Were they high, low? Okay. What's your mowing height?
Mowing height in the outfield, so we're going to be doing 3/4 inch. We're at 1 inch. We're doing 3/4 inch. And
Okay.
fields are going to be half inch. I just picked up some free real mowers from above or stuff.
Okay.
Aeration, core aeration, a couple times a year.
Do you
Okay.
just return them back in, or do you remove them? Any kind of top dressing? Okay.
Say that one more time.
He just, I assume, drags them back in.
Okay.
No removal and top dressing.
And then traffic distribution, high.
Typical for baseball.
Okay. All right. So this is kind of the crux of the situation. With all the information that we've gotten about this field and to review, so we're in California, and we're on a sandy loam. We're managing Bermuda grass. We overseed. We have 4 fields in total that are under this regime, mainly used for baseball. We've got crabgrass issues, some POA issues, which I'm going to assume are probably around overseeding, would be my guess. Sedge issues, Dallas grass issues, and some broadleaf weeds. So how do we, with knowing that plus this layer of not enough nitrogen fertility, how do we build a program? So, Dr. Henry, what do you think to start in the spring?
Well, I mean, not just assuming chemically, but I think the first thing, and this is difficult to do since you're not getting enough money, is you need to take care of the nitrogen input issue.
Sure. And I think we could, if we have the availability to do it, would make a spring app. That spring app's probably going to target summer annual weeds, right? Probably crabgrass, maybe some goosegrass if we can put out something with residual activity, right? So we'd make a spring app. We're going to target crab. We're going to target goose. And maybe we do barricade on fertilizer to start.
Good start.
All right. That's going to be a group 3. If you have questions about what group number means, herbicides are grouped by their mode of action. Mode of action is an indicator of how the herbicide works to control a weed, right? So when we have resistance issues, one of the things that we prescribe is use something of a different mode of action. That's hard to keep track of. Numbers are easy to keep track of. So if you look on a label, you see a group number, that's an indicator of how that works. So when we want to use something different, then we can switch group numbers and we're into a product that works differently. That's going to break mode of action selection for resistant weeds. So we're going to go into this field in the spring. We're going to put out Barricade, which is a mitotic inhibiting herbicide with residual activity. We're going to target goosegrass and crabgrass pre-emergence with that treatment, plus supply a little bit of fertilizer. Then what do you think, Dr. Henry? Maybe come back midsummer.
I mean, you're going to start having to address the potential that you're going to have open turf now if you're starting to control some of these weeds, along with the fact that you've got.
Okay.
Just fixing to ask if he has complete coverage right now.
That's a good question.
It's a good question. So,
Coverage is good.
complete coverage. Okay. So you said your play is March through July, right?
Yes.
So we'd probably put this pre-out before that would start, would be my guess. I don't know, is Modesto Northern California or Southern?
2 hours east of San Francisco.
All right, so Northern. Okay. So we'd have the pre-down, would be playing. What's the typical program for kind of recovering the field when the traffic's over?
Again, dealing with the board of directors, whatever they want seems to be the case. But when the season's over, you mean? Or
Sure.
Season's over. This season coming up, it's going to be tear out the lips and do some irrigation.
Okay. So why don't we say we're going to do a summer application. We're going to target crab post, some broadleaf weeds, particularly clover, and we're going to use something like quinclorac to do that, right? You said you'd use Q4D in the past, so we're going to use a quinclorac-containing herbicide, quinclorac. That is a group 4 product. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, quinclorac is the active ingredient in Drive. We think of that as a crabgrass herbicide post-emergence. It has a very wide broadleaf spectrum to go with it. We see quinclorac sold often in mixtures with other active ingredients. So you said you used Q4D. I'm not sure what's in that product, honestly, but I assume there's some other things in there, particularly 2,4-D based on that trade name. We see quinclorac sold with sulfentrazone as solitaire, so that would be a single application crab, broadleaf, and some sedge activity herbicide. There's a lot of different tools out there with quinclorac included. One of the reasons quinclorac makes sense in this gentleman's field is that there is some utility around new establishments. So if you needed to come in and maybe resprig or do some seeding, quinclorac has safety in that use pattern, not only before new establishment, but immediately following emergence of newly established grass. So we've gone through, we've got the spring program, Barricade Pre, we're going to play some games, we're going to come through after that in the summer, maybe come through and touch up any breakthrough while we're doing field renovation to try to recover that Bermuda grass, and then we're going to need to overseed in the fall, correct? And you ranked POA as a 6 on your field. So one of the challenges in overseeding is that we have POA issues, right? Because we've got to supply all the things to get the ryegrass to germinate, and then with that comes annual bluegrass. And we don't have a lot that's going to be labeled to do that. I would propose we start
Spectacle.
with not spectacle. I would propose we start with Revolver prior to overseeding because we've got Barricade early, and we don't want to do Barricade, right? So we're going to do a fall application And we're going to call this pre-overseed. And we're going to target POA with this.
So do you have a potential to do like an irrigation audit? I know you said your irrigation system's kind of a hodgepodge.
Yeah, I used to be a landscaper, so I have what I need to do it. It's just getting the time to do it. But yeah, it's and actually what I did about a month ago, I had a surveyor come in and survey elevations and everything. So it's a topo map of my fields now.
Yep.
And labeled in where all the irrigation is, and I can see where everything is and where I need to move everything.
Okay.
So that's the other plan, is to just start trenching and moving in so I get full coverage.
Because I've done that in Georgia with certain groups that are, I work a lot with K through 12 because I feel like I can help them the most, and they usually have the most problems. And I've gone in and mapped, irrigation systems, and then shown them that the inaccuracies in the system are leading to the weed issues. And if it would take X amount of money to rectify the irrigation system, and if you don't, this is how much money you're putting in towards the chemical inputs, and then kind of show them how they do, counterbalance one another. And usually it kind of greases the wheels a little bit for them to understand that, hey, I need to look at the irrigation system as well, if not first.
So Revolver is a ALS inhibiting herbicide group 2. One of the unique attributes of it, you can use it before overseeding. I believe the label gives you a 7 to 10 day window. So you could put the application down. It's going to control any annual bluegrass that has emerged prior to overseeding with a minor residual activity window. You wait 7 to 10 days, you come in, you put your overseed down. There's some tools for annual bluegrass management post in overseeded turf that we can consider, but one of the things that we're going to walk through here is ways that you can change this from year to year. We're just kind of building a base to start. So that's a pretty good treatment pre-overseed. I don't know that we have anything left to do here. What do you think, Gerald?
I'd wait 14 days.
You want to go 14 days for extra safety?
Yeah.
All right.
I think the label does say 14.
I don't remember, but it's being recorded, so we should probably err on the side of caution. All right. Okay. So I think we're pretty good. You feel like we're pretty good?
I'm feeling good so far.
Feel good so far. All right. So the challenge here with programming is that this might not make budgetary sense for you, right? Let's pretend that it does for the sake of the conversation, right? We know that if we do the same thing every year, we're just selecting for resistant weeds. We're just getting a situation where these products aren't going to work if we don't diversify what we're doing. So the challenge is you build a program and then you have to change it from year to year, right? And that may seem counterintuitive, but it's one of those hurdles that we have to kind of walk through. The best way I can explain this is to use an analogy or an illustration, if you will, from the Air Force. So retired Colonel John Boyd from the United States Air Force, he developed this system that they use to train fighter pilots in the Air Force, and it's called the OODA loop. OODA stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. And what they have these pilots do is they want to teach them that no matter what the situation is, the first thing that you do is you step away and you observe what's happening. And then you orient what's happening into a bigger context, right? And then you make a decision of what you're going to do, and then you actually go and do it. And the cycle repeats itself. So in the context of a weed control discussion, what this really means is like we go through a season, we observe what happens on our field. You've all done that in 2019 as you're coming into 2020. You know what weeds were problems last year, where there were successes, where there were failures. We observe what's happening. We try to orient that into a bigger context, right? So if you had crabgrass issues this year or you had goosegrass issues, how does that relate to the weather that you had at your location? How does that relate to maybe you had a high school tournament that you don't usually have and you had extra traffic? Or I was just talking with Phil here in the front row about things were good at his field leading into the fall. We've had a month and a half of heavy rainfall and things look very different. Orienting your observations into a bigger context of what's happening. Then you make a decision of what you're going to do. Then you go and do it, and you repeat it, right? So theoretically, what we've just done, We've taken this gentleman's observations from his field. We've tried to orient them as best we can, having never been there and being complete strangers until 5 minutes ago. Orient them into a bigger context. We've made some decisions of what we're going to do in terms of a program. And then we're going to go and put this into action, right? And that is kind of the crux of what best practices are for programmatic thinking, that we monitor what happens on a field. We take notes throughout the year, right? So if you have crabgrass breakthrough, when did you have that crabgrass breakthrough? If you failed on goosegrass, when did you fail on goosegrass? If you had sedges in July, noting that you had sedges in July. And then the last best practice is to check all the boxes, right? Were we calibrated? Did we mix? Did we have our best applicator do it? All of these things that need to be in place to make appropriate adjustments for the following season. So now we've done this. How do we switch this for this field in Modesto, California to look differently for the next year? So let's try to do that.
I'd also try to track, locations of specific things. Get a good understanding of where you have issues with one weed versus another, or where you may have some environmental differences, low areas, poor irrigation, to kind of sync that up with what you're seeing as well.
Sometimes your timing is, like he was saying, tracking. You say, hey, just wait a few more weeks or a few more months instead of not doing it again, just do it now, something like that.
I mean, we had that in Georgia. This past winter, we were putting out pre-emergence in late January. And then I'm getting calls saying I get breakthrough from a pre-emerge, 40, 60 days after. And that's not a big surprise, because not only did we spray so early, but then we had almost 80 inches in Athens for the year. And most of it was coming down. That's like 30 inches more than Seattle. Most of it was coming down in that time frame. So not only are you putting out something early and expecting it to last for an extra 40 days or so, but you're getting a lot of rainfall that's pushing most of that material through over time. So like Jim said, you got to think on the fly. You got to be prepared that if, plan A is not working and you have an inkling of why, you got to be able to make a change to plan B, C, D, E, down the road to kind of keep this thing. It's sort of lots of moving parts. Learn when to step away from the table and go to the next game.
So how can we change this audience interaction? How can this gentleman do something different for his spring program than put barricade on fertilizer out? Come on, Tanner. What can you do? Ronstar. Okay, it's a good suggestion. Ronstar, maybe on a fertilizer carrier, because that's an issue with this field. All right, so Ronstar is oxidiazone. I'm going to capture this while I talk here. Well, you tell them about Ronstar while I type. You won more games than us.
I'm not going to tell you too much about Ronstar, but I am going to tell you, and this kind of segues back to when Jim was talking about interactions with early product purchase. Jim and I work with all of these companies. No one is going to put a product on the market that doesn't work. Maybe it doesn't work under certain circumstances, specific environments, maybe applicator misuse. Don't be afraid to change some of your products up. Don't be afraid to use generics. I know generic is a dirty word, but it's really not. Most of the companies that are selling these generics are, for the most part, working hand in hand with the companies that are not selling the generics. Again, no one's going to put millions upon millions of dollars into a product that doesn't work. So just like Jim and I are scientists, you can be the same at your facility. You don't have to treat every field the same way either. You can try some practice on one field and then simultaneously try some other plan on another, knowing that you may have different outcomes. Maybe they're the same outcome, but then you're sort of testing things on your own. You're not all in on one specific plan.
So if we look at this, oxidiazone, there's a lot of oxidiazones out there, but oxidiazone on fertilizer carrier, it's a PPO inhibitor, group 14. So what that means in a practical sense is this is going to control crabgrass and goosegrass different than barricade, right? So now we're not using barricade every single year, selecting for these populations that can come through barricade. We've switched our active ingredient. right? Now we've got a different selection out there to do that. The other thing, we should have noted this when we talked about Barricade on fertilizer, is that slow release fertilizer technology has really improved. So when we talk about a herbicide on a fertilizer carrier, it's implied that this is going to be a slow release fertilizer for the duration of the season, or as close to the duration of the season as we can get. So we're going to do oxidizone on fertilizer. I would tell you that we talked a little bit about goosegrass in the beginning. Oxidizone is one of our premier pre-herbicides for goosegrass control.
It's the best.
What was that?
It's the best.
That it's being recorded.
It is right now.
And one of the key things about oxidizone is it's really expensive, right? It's one of the more pricier pre's out there. And the data are very clear that you want to be at 3 pounds of active ingredient per acre to get consistent control. If you try to save $1 and get to 2 pounds, that's going to be just kind of risky in terms of what you're going to see results-wise. So do what you can to get to a 3-pound rate on Ronstar.
One of the other things, too, is, and he didn't allude to this, is he's not having this problem, but if you have a lot of traffic and you're trying to recover coming out of winter dormancy, you're going to get the quickest recovery fill-in on your Bermuda grass with an oxidizone application compared to some of the other chemistries, because you're not going to have issues with root pruning a little bit, but not to the level of something like Spectacle and some of the other dinitroanilins. So it is safer with that respect.
Question?
His main problem is goosegrass. Would you try dimension as a pre-emergent in the springtime?
So it's a good question. The question was, if goosegrass is the issue, could we try dimension in the springtime? Conceptually, we could, right? And dimension is labeled for goosegrass control. The reason that that would not make sense in a year 2 is that he used a group 3 mitotic inhibitor in year 1 in Barricade. And dimension is the same mode of action as Barricade. And we want to try to diversify that mode of action group as best we can. So the Ronstar or the oxidizone makes more sense here because it's a different mode of action group. The next year, he could go into dimension. Or in year 1, we just picked Barricade as the first thing that came to mind. That easily could have been a dimension application.
Have you noticed any burn potential on Bermuda grass with dimension?
Burn potential on Bermuda grass with dimension. I have not seen that. Have you seen that?
No.
Okay. Question?
So you're saying you could rotate back to your option 1 the next year?
Absolutely. And you can change the pieces, right?
Every other year.
Exactly. It's kind of like, think about like calling plays in football. You can run, then pass, then run, then pass, and it can be different routes every time, right? That's what we're trying to kind of get to here.
It's not just for resistance. One of the things that we have noticed is I get a lot of calls from people that say, I've used Barricade for 6 to 8 years, and I used to get, maybe 50, 60 days out of it, and now I'm only getting 30 days. And they'll say, well, I must have, resistant POA. And no, what's happening is you're selecting for a microbial population within the soil that is actually utilizing that chemistry as food, and it's breaking it down quicker.
This is very, very well documented in crop situations. There's little documentation of it in turf, but we know it happens. It's just there hasn't been funding available to kind of prove that it's happening. But all of kind of the ancillary information is there to show us that this is likely what's happening, particularly with oxidizone. So there's been plenty of turfgrass managers that have paid for oxidizone the past 3 years, and they have not seen the results that they wanted. And the immediate thought is, well, it's got to be resistance, right? And there have been a few confirmations, I think 2 total, of oxidizone resistance in goosegrass, but that doesn't line up with the extent of the product failures, right? And this idea of, well, these are facilities that are using oxidizone every single year, and selecting for enhanced degradation in the soil makes a lot of sense. So, any other questions before we talk about how he's going to rotate in the summer? Go ahead.
Have you guys found it's important to rotate your pre-emergent also, or are we more focused on post-emergent as far as the rotation?
Question, is it more important to rotate pre's or posts? It's more important to rotate everything, right? It's across the board. You want to try to rotate what you're doing. And the point about dimension is well taken, because I think our industry makes it hard to know what a true rotation is sometimes, right? Because we go to trade shows and we see new products with new names that we're not familiar with, and you think, well, this is new. I've never used this before. But if it's the same mode of action group, it's not a rotation because it's the same mechanism to do the job.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the actual use of the numbers on the label is a voluntary thing. It's not.
It's changing.
Has it
So
changed?
I'm on
Okay.
the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee, and it's now changing to become across the board in only a numbering system. If you remember, at one point there was letters and numbers, which was they're like as clear as mud. Now it's going to be all standardized numbers, which is excellent.
Okay.
Like his question is, sometimes the climate can change your reactions too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we think we have a situation. This is a good story. Public facility, Knoxville, Tennessee, where Phil here works and I work. Not Phil's facility. They were on a program, limited budget. They were using Barricade for their summer annual weed control program. And what they would do, they were Bermuda grass, so they would put their Barricade out with Roundup during dormancy. It's a really common treatment. So they'd make the sap every year, and eventually the Barricade didn't work on goosegrass anymore. So the field manager says, I need to do something. So sat down, wanted to build a program, which I was happy to hear. And he said, well, it still works on crabgrass, so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to put my Roundup out with Barricade and use it only for crabgrass. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to make a sequential application, and I'm going to use Ronstar on fertilizer, right? And that's going to be positioned closer to goosegrass, and maybe that's going to be enough to push the envelope on the goosegrass because it's a different mode of action in terms of control. He was limited budget-wise to a 2-pound rate, and he made his application based on a calendar schedule like he always had done. He would make his Roundup Barricade application, and then 8 weeks later he'd come in and make a sequential. So he does this, and his goosegrass control is terrible, and immediately thinks maybe this is enhanced soil degradation, maybe it's resistance. We kind of dig into this, and there's a goosegrass emergence model that was developed at Rutgers that looks basically at your weather conditions and can accurately predict how much goosegrass you have at any given point in the year. So we applied that data set to the weather from Knoxville, Tennessee in 2019. He made his application on an 8-week interval, as he had always done, which lined up to be May 2nd, and the model had us at 48% goosegrass emergence. Well, it's no surprise that a pre-emergence herbicide did not do what it was supposed to do with 48% emergence from the soil. But to your point, Phil, that's just an example of that shift, and that's where taking a note about when you saw the breakthrough to make an adjustment in your program the next year makes a lot of sense. All right. We good? Go ahead.
What is your thoughts on the efficacy of combination granular versus liquid?
Okay.
And then additionally, water requirements for crab and goose control.
Okay. So can you elaborate just as a general what works better, liquids or granulars?
Right.
In combination?
No, not combination.
Okay.
Equally, so you mentioned granular for the first one.
Okay.
Versus liquid.
So in my opinion, it kind of depends on how the herbicide gets into the plant, right? So when we think about pre-products, they enter the plants through the roots. So I like the idea of putting that out on a granule to get down into the soil. But when you look at if you look at the testing in terms of Gerald tests it, I test it, granular versus liquid, the spray tends to perform a little bit better. Would you agree?
Yeah, one of the things, though, you also have to, and this is where oddball purchases of maybe some generic material may come into play. You have to pay attention to particle size.
Yeah, big time.
If you have large particle sizes, just keep in mind that the distribution of those when they go through the canopy is not going to be really good, and that can affect placement of the material, in the soil profile. And it's even harder when you're trying to control something post-emergent on the surface. So that's a lot of stuff a lot of the weed and feed materials, you have to pay attention to particle size.
And those particle sizes are assessed on what's called a size guide number, right? And that is an indicator of how big the particles are. And I've seen everything from particle size not stated to size guide numbers at 250, which is ginormous.
Or if they vary largely within the same bag.
You want to try to get a small SGN number if you're using a granular product. And you also want to try to get a small active ingredient load on the prill. The reason for that is then if I'm trying to put out 1 pound per unit area and there's not a lot of herbicide on those prills, it takes more prills in that space to deliver that 1 pound, right? And then your coverage is theoretically better in concept. That's difficult, though, because it takes more product to do the job. The spread rate's higher. The process of putting it out's more tricky. It's anything else you think we're missing there on that?
No, I mean, I would agree with the spray. We've actually even started messing around with carrier volumes to try and get better coverage as well. So a lot of people have gone down low to 20 gallons per acre. We're even looking at going all the way up to 120 gallons per acre. And I know that's probably kind of but we see a lot better control simply because of coverage.
Have you done research on watering after and watering it in? Because I think dimension is a half an inch.
With respect to goosegrass?
Yeah.
He has.
Yeah, and that irrigation in is much, much needed. I mean, that is particularly with dimension. So dimension can photo degrade. So to move it into the root zone with irrigation is super critical. And that's going to be true with most any pre to get it into the area where you want it to do its job.
So you've seen some of the poor control related to those two, either wrong SGN number or liquid versus granular, and then not watering it in?
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things that we have to caution people on is like we're seeing more resistance in like confirmed situations that we do testing on, but that is not the reason for product failure in most cases. In most cases, product failure is I'd probably say a calibration error and then an application error, and then maybe the wrong product for the wrong weed are the top 3 reasons.
Weed ID is a big one, too.
Weed ID is a huge thing.
I've shown up for resistant confirmation, and someone thought goosegrass was crabgrass and vice versa, and chemistries are way different post-emergent.
Yeah, one of I didn't get any broadleaf weed control, and you show up and there's not a broadleaf weed on the property, and it's all Dallas grass, and the leaves are really wide. It's broad.
It's broad.
It's broad. It's just that ID is important. Okay, so let's
question over there.
Go ahead. Great. All right, it's a great question. So, aerification timing with pre-emergent. The data that we have, research-wise, I think Aaron Patton worked on this maybe 5 years ago. With a standard aerification setup, you don't affect enough of the surface area to compromise weed control with a typical aeration spacing and tine diameter, even when you got to really aggressive sizes. I know you've worked on that a little since Aaron. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, the only thing that I can say differently is that if you aerify and leave the course on the surface, you can bring some weed seed to the surface, and because it's no longer in the soil profile, it's not in contact with the chemistries, you can get germination above ground. It tends obviously not to root down, and a lot of times they die off, but you can affect it that way.
And then, going back to the on fertilizer question here, particularly with oxadiazone, one of the reasons fertilizer products are used is like for this gentleman's field in California, we couldn't spray oxadiazone on it over the top because it would injure the overseeded rye and it would injure the Bermuda grass if there was any green tissue. So the only way we can get it down is to use a fertilizer carrier to get it through the canopy. I don't think there are too many other examples of that. Oxadiazone is the top one that comes to mind for me. Any other questions before we pick a summer broadleaf, sedge, etc. for this gentleman?
Kind of piggyback on his question about granular versus liquid. So if you don't have the option to irrigate it in, is there any research done on the sun breaks down granular quicker for the sun would, I guess, break down granular quicker or liquid quicker?
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen any work on that about degradation based on formulation without irrigation. Have you?
I know our DOT did some work where they were looking at, not being able to water in, and they still had they had good control. But I mean, if I'd rather spray and not be able to water in than.
Agreed.
But I think the canopy height's going to play a role in that, and whether or not. And again, that's why I would say smaller particle sizes are going to work their way through the canopy, and photodegradation will be limited, and then eventually, hopefully, it's going to rain.
Hopefully.
So I would probably pay attention a lot to particle size in that situation.
And then the other thing is the time when you put it out, right? So I don't know what you manage in terms of a turf grass species, but if you're on this gentleman's field and it's Bermuda grass, and I'm going to put this out at 9 o'clock in the morning, there's going to be a lot of dew there, and that's an environment where that particle is then going to stick to the leaf and not make it into the canopy. And if you can make the app to dry turf so the material falls through and gets into the soil, that's going to set you up for more success. All right, Gerald, pick a summer product for this gentleman because we're going to run out of time for a cool season scenario.
What are we focusing on?
Summer.
No, I mean,
I believe the gentleman said he had clover issues.
You want me to pick one product with all that?
Come on, man. Something different than what we did last time. We did a quinclorac product last summer.
I mean, you could do sort of a Celsius, focusing on.
You want to blow his budget, don't you?
I'll donate the Celsius, and then you can put the Celsius out.
All right.
Next year, maybe we'll just start handing chemicals.
And we're going to target broadleaf
You get
weeds.
Celsius. You get a Celsius.
Well, I can't do. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. That's too expensive. We're going to do metsulfuron.
Ooh.
Uh-oh, was that an ooh from the crowd or from you?
That was me.
So metsulfuron on a warm season field. Metsulfuron's an ALS inhibitor, group 2, pretty broad spectrum of broadleaf weed control. Label for Bermuda grass doesn't take much. I think the rates range from 1/4 to 3/4 of an ounce per acre.
We're not taking sedge into consideration.
I've got sedge here.
All right.
Yeah, that's
I
right,
take it all
buddy.
back. I know it's being recorded.
Go Dogs.
Fair enough. All right. Celsius. And that is a 2 and a 4, right? Because it's thiocarbazone, iodosulfuron, and dicamba.
Dicamba, yep.
And it's a lot of dicamba. All right, you want to talk to them about Celsius?
I mean, for me, the game changer with Celsius, and it doesn't have much to do with what we're talking about here, is that it's safe on St. Augustine grass and centipede, which obviously are not really big for sports turf, at least not in this country. It's probably one of the widest spectrum as far as broadleaf weed control. You throw sedges in there and a few other things. One of the things that's sort of unique about it is the thiocarbazone, which is an ALS product that's within this material, actually also acts as a pre-emergent. So it's got both post and pre-activity. I don't know what else you want me to say
I
about
think
it.
that covers it. And then fall, so we used Revolver pre-overseeding in year 1, which is a group 2 ALS inhibitor. We haven't used a mitotic inhibitor yet in the season, so we can switch and go into, say, a barricade program before overseeding.
So I will throw this out there, though. So I have done research with both Celsius and Tribute Total. If you are going to overseed, I want to say that you need to be, was it 4-6 weeks?
Yeah, and then, I think you'd be fine with the summer program because the barricade label
I'm just saying if you're
is 8
spraying
to 10.
too far down the road.
Yeah, you got to avoid it. So I think that's 8 to 10 weeks before, if I remember right.
Because most people are not expecting a pre-activity from a post-emergent application.
And if you look at a barricade label, there's a specific set of directions for barricade use pre-overseeding. The kind of nuts and bolts of the concept is it takes the 1x use rate, you put out half of that, you put it out well before, like 8 to 10 weeks before you would overseed, and it's going to control any early emerging annual bluegrass that you might have, because it's one of those things we don't have a good trigger for is when do we see POA germination exactly in terms of having a model to predict when it'll happen. And then it allows you the ability, once the ryegrass is up, you're mowing it, it's matured, you can come in, if needed, with another barricade application and take the second half of that 1X and put it out on your established ryegrass once you feel comfortable. In some cases, particularly a low-pressure case, that might not be needed. Think we covered it?
Yeah, you got 35 minutes left to do cool season example.
Come on, lead us to the promised land, buddy. Any questions before we leave warm season turf? Because we're going to switch gears and go cool season here. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can probably send it to you after. He'll just save the whole presentation.
Or do like recycle dressing like that. And would you recommend, which pre-emergent recommend after you do that practice so you can avoid that weeds?
So I think the question here is pre-emergence use after aerification? Am I interpreting you correctly? Is that the question?
Yes, so to avoid that weeds that you bring it up to germinate. You're talking about recycle dresser. Recycle dresser does that a lot, yeah. That's because it brings the top, all the soil up. When you drag it, you're just spreading the seeds out.
So I have
Seeds all over.
I have no familiarity with a recycle dresser. Do you?
Are you talking about the core recycler?
No, it's a machine from Coral called recycle dresser. And when it works on lines, so it brings the blade brings the soil up and they spread it all over. So you do it's a great machine because you do two processes at the same time. You have a purification, decompaction, and top dressing. But one of the things that we see if you do parks or things like that, you bring all the seeds up.
It's not a Toro product. It was shown in the previous seminar. I've never seen it either. No, it's Coral.
It's a Coral.
Coral.
I haven't looked at it in conjunction.
Yeah, I mean,
with
I think to
pre's.
answer your question, I don't know of a specific pre that is married to any sort of cultivation practice in terms of this is the pre to use when you're cultivating. For me, product selection is just based on the weeds that you're trying to control in the turf that you're trying to control at the time that you're trying to do it, right? So if you think you're bringing enough up to the soil, I don't know that another pre makes sense there because you'd have a pre down, you'd come in, you'd aerify. I kind of think you'd germinate, let see what germinates from that, and then kind of make decisions then, rather than try to blanket it with another soil residual activity.
Yeah, I mean that's. I would.
It get too late if you let that happen. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, it can blow
It's
up.
somewhere
Good.
verification. It just does slips, but it goes in.
Okay.
9 goes in the ground.
Okay.
And it comes up, and you can make it go deeper, and the more sand it brings up, and it spreads it for top dressing. So
Okay.
it's similar to, towards your surface area is aerification that goes down. So I'm not sure, your pre-emergent that you said about aerification should be the same.
Would be the same. Okay.
Machine.
An application as a triumph would be an option there because of the safety using around the season.
Yeah, in a cool season situation. So Tanner here was thinking about mesotrione, which is the active ingredient in tenacity. That would be something that would be safe around seeding if you were to use that device, bring a bunch of product up to the surface, and then need to do reseeding around it. It's a good suggestion, and a perfect segue into cool season turf. So let's move into that.
Does anyone here want to volunteer to be the cool season site?
Look at them go.
Jim will give you a nice crisp $20 bill. Come on, no victims?
Come on, Tanner. I'm going to call on you.
No one here is from a cool climate? Come on, we're both Yankees right here. You can help us out.
All right, Tanner. Come on.
All right. Central Pennsylvania,
Okay.
Silball. Mixed stand of blue and rye. The only overseeding done is in the fall. Around sports, we'll say gold mouse or hash, between the hashes with perennial rye. No irrigation.
Wow.
Standard municipal fields.
Anything else?
Limited
Okay.
Did you say you had any way to do cultivation?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Okay.
How do you? What do you do for cultivation? Hollow tine.
Core aeration in the fall.
Okay.
Is it
Cores there.
open spoon or is it an actual core air fire?
Core air fire.
Okay.
So you want to rate your weeds pressure-wise? 1's low, 9's high. And you can have misses. Like if you don't have Dallas grass, you don't have to rate it. Just
So crabgrass we'll say is a 4.
okay.
Goosegrass is a 2. Poe is a 5. Sedge is at 4. No Dallas, no signal. Broadleaf weeds, 3.
Any other weed of interest?
I mean, we could say violets if you want.
Okay.
Some broadleaf weed.
This is a broadleaf weed. Thanks, Dr. Henry.
You have more problems with perennials or annual broadleaf weeds?
Poetro.
Really interesting.
All right, let's cancel this now.
All right. Well, that concludes the presentation. Thank you for coming.
Are you saying you're trying to turn your fields to poetry? Is that?
All right. So Tanner has the guinea pig nitrogen program.
He lost me at cool season.
3 pounds N per year.
Okay.
P and K are sufficient.
Okay.